All right, so this is part 2 of chapter 1. This is talking about homeostasis. So we want to define homeostasis, right? Homeostasis is the ability to maintain a relatively constant internal environment. So your body's cells and organs work together to maintain this constant internal environment. Components of your internal environment are examples like temperature, right? We know that we have to have around the same temperature. So it doesn't have to be exactly 37 degrees Celsius. Okay. It might drop down a couple of points here and there or go up a couple of points here and there, but it's around 37 degrees Celsius. So your nervous system and your skin, all, the mechanisms to help you cool down or warm up, those are all working together to keep your body at a 37 degrees Celsius. Your total volume of fluids is maintained. Your composition of those fluids are maintained. What ions are present. Those are all homeostatic mechanisms. So we don't fall out of that range. If we do fall out of that set point range, then that can cause disease or some kind of disorder. And it can have, really bad implications on your body function. So it does require organ system integration, right? So let's just take temperature, for example. What kind of organ systems are involved in temperature regulation, right? So how do you know you're overheating? Your nervous system can detect the temperature. You have thermoreceptors on your skin. They're going to feed back to the brain. Your brain stem can regulate your internal body temperature. So your nervous system works together with your skin, right? The integumentary system, because your skin is responsible for cooling with sweating and also by dilating those blood vessels so the blood comes to the surface of your body more, which then you are involving the cardiovascular system, right? Because the blood vessels are going to dilate and bring the blood to the surface. We are also thinking about if you're cold, right? So just this temperature, if you get cold, then you start to shiver, which includes your muscular system, right? And also the vasoconstriction of your blood vessels so that blood moves away from the surface of your skin and you maintain that heat in the core of your body. So it does require multiple systems to work together to maintain homeostatic, a homeostatic set point. All right, so we also mentioned that disruption of homeostasis is the basis for disease and also for death. All right, so some terms that you want to be familiar with when you talk about homeostasis is this variable that we were talking about. So whatever's being regulated, right, that's the regulation variable. So we talked about temperature, right? We could also talk about a regulated variable being like blood pH. So any part of your body that's regulated, that there is a set point for, that's a regulated variable. So our blood glucose concentration, we'll look at an example of that. So the set point then, right, that's the exact point or that roundabout area where your body always wants to keep these regulated variables at. So how your body works to keep homeostasis is there's two mechanisms. There's negative feedback and there's also something called positive feedback. But negative feedback is by and large the most common way that your body maintains homeostasis. So there is a way to detect a change in set point. And those things are called sensors, right? So sensors are going to be able to detect a change in the set point. And then you will have some kind of signal, and your textbook calls it an error signal. That is the difference between the set point and now what's happening. So if your body temperature goes up a little bit, right, that is going to be the error signal. And then there's going to be a feedback mechanism where there's going to be an effector. So there's going to be tissues or cells that will try and change the error signal so it goes back to the set point. All right, so negative feedback, you always want to move back towards the set point. You're not, and so that's all it is. So there's a feedback mechanism in place in your body that always wants to move that the variable, that regulated variable back to the set point. So for negative feedback, right, it just because we move the opposite direction. So if a regulated variable decreases, the system will make it increase. If Vice versa, if the regulated variable increases, then the system responds to decrease it. All right, so it's self-correcting system. So let's take a look at the way your textbook illustrates the feedback mechanism. So this example deals with blood sugar. So your blood glucose has a normal concentration in the bloodstream. And you can see here it is, it's 100 milligrams per deciliter. And we're going to look at the change, right? So there's going to be a change here and it rises. So this might be that you just ate a meal. So your blood glucose rises and you have an error signal. And the error signal is increasing. And then there's going to be a regulatory mechanism activated. And then your blood glucose will start to fall. The error signal decreases and then until you reach that normal set point again. So let's take a look at the loop here. So negative feedback loops are often drawn in this way where you have a feedback, right? So there's some result that feeds back to become a new stimulus. But let's just start at the beginning. So there's a change in your blood glucose level. So you're increasing your blood glucose because maybe you ate something. So then you have this regulatory or integrating center. So you have beta cells of your pancreas. So the beta cells of your pancreas release insulin. Insulin is a hormone that makes it possible for your cells to use and take up that glucose. So if there's a lot of glucose in your blood that's over the set point, your cells want to absorb that glucose. So it cannot be absorbed unless there's insulin present. So this is your response in blue, your physiological response. It increases signals to effectors. So your insulin will be secreted by your beta cells. The effectors are going to be the cells in your body. So that insulin will move through your bloodstream to the cells of your body. And then your cells will start to take up that glucose in the bloodstream. And as a result, the blood glucose starts to fall, right? So that falling of that level is going to feed back, right, to the initial stimulus. So the stimulus has changed. It has gotten less, right? So then the loop just continues on. Maybe the beta cells of the pancreas secrete less insulin because the error signal is less. The cells will continue to take up glucose until the glucose level gets back to a normal point. So these two work together, right? The effectors and so the response and the effectors work together to get glucose, get glucose back to its set point. When the set point is reached, then your integrating center will no longer secrete insulin, right? Because we don't want to go under, we don't want to undershoot our set point. So we're going to stop secreting insulin so that the blood glucose level stays constant in your bloodstream. Let's look at another way this is illustrated. This is from Khan Academy. And if you don't know Khan Academy, K-A-H-N, this is a great resource for small bite-sized tutorials. They have a really robust physiology section. But let's take a look at this. So this is our set point. This is our regulated variable, right? Our blood glucose levels. And we looked at this, right? So let's say you eat a meal, we have high blood glucose, we have our beta cells of the pancreas secreting insulin, right? So we can see the insulin going into the bloodstream. The insulin will then have an effect all over the body. So the effectors here are all the cells of the body. So your mitochondria will start to break down the glucose and create ATP. So it'll take up the glucose. And also your liver might take up that extra glucose and store it as glycogen. Therefore, the blood glucose level concentration drops and we go back to our set point. Let's look at the opposite, right? Let's say we are very hungry and we haven't eaten for hours and hours and our blood glucose is dropping. So there's another hormone that is a regulatory hormone in this feedback loop called glucagon. Okay, and glucagon are made by a separate set of cells. They're called alpha cells. So alpha cells of the pancreas will release glucagon, and glucagon in the bloodstream is going to the effector, the liver. So the liver is the one that's going to be responsible, the one organ that's responsible for regulating low glucose levels, because it's the only one that can actually send glucose to the bloodstream. So glucagon is going to be signals to the liver to start breaking down glycogen into glucose. The glucose gets liberated into the bloodstream, raising that blood glucose concentration back to our set point. Okay, so both of these are examples of negative feedback, because we are always moving, whether you're increasing the blood glucose levels or you have a fall in blood glucose levels, you're always moving it back to that central normal level. All right, let's look at the opposite kind of feedback loop called positive feedback. And this is a response that pushes the stimulus even further in the direction that's already heading. So I like to think of this as like an emotional thing, right? If you're angry, something made you angry, maybe a thought made you angry, you're thinking about it more, it gets you even more angry, then you think about it even more, it gets you even more angry. So that's your positive feedback loop. Let's look at it in a more physiological way. Let's look at the pituitary gland in our ovaries. So ovulation, I'm jumping down to number 3, the example here. Ovulation in females is triggered by a surge in luteinizing hormone and estrogen. So the pituitary gland is going to be responsible for secreting your luteinizing hormone. The luteinizing hormone is your initial stimulus here. It's going to travel through the bloodstream and it's going to act on the ovaries. The ovaries respond to luteinizing hormone by secreting estrogen. So the result is estrogen secretion. Now, estrogen in the bloodstream actually causes the pituitary gland to produce more luteinizing hormone. So we get more luteinizing hormone making more estrogen, right? And we can see that this is just a feedback loop that creates more and more and more luteinizing hormone, more and more and more estrogen. So when does it stop, right? Because you think about, well, this is a positive feedback loop. There's no end to it, but there is, but it's an external signal. So there's some kind of external factor that shuts down the this positive feedback loop. Okay, so in this particular example, the luteinizing hormone that surges way up in concentration prompts ovulation. So there's a certain concentration of luteinizing hormone that's reached that triggers ovulation, and ovulation shuts down the ovaries and it cannot produce any more estrogen. So that shutdown, in this case, ovulation, right? I can't talk and write at the same time. Ovulation is the trigger that shuts down your estrogen secretion. So the positive feedback loops always move the stimulus further and further in greater concentrations in the same direction until there's an external variable that comes in and shuts it down. Okay, so it doesn't go on forever. There is a shutdown. Okay, so this is basically our cartoon of positive negative feedback. Right, positive feedback is more. We're moving the stimulus into the direction that's already moving in, and then negative feedback is counteracting that change and pushing everything back towards a set point. All right, and I want to say really quickly that the Amoeba sisters here, they also do really good tutorials. It's maybe a little bit less, advanced. It might be aimed more at a younger audience or a more introductory audience, but you're introductory, right? This is introduction to physiology. So there might be some really helpful animated tutorials that they have. I highly recommend them to my Bio 3 class, and I recommend them across the board to anybody who's struggling with a concept in biology. All right, so I want you to look at this example and tell me, is it positive or negative feedback? So I'll walk you through it. So we have a baby that's getting ready for childbirth. The head of the baby is pushing into the cervix. the nerve impulses from the cervix are transmitted to the brain. The brain is stimulated, the pituitary gland here is stimulated to secrete oxytocin. This is our hormone. Okay, so our hormone, the oxytocin, is carried to the bloodstream and goes to the uterus. The uterus is going to contract. So oxytocin makes the uterus contract and pushes the baby towards the cervix. That pushing against the cervix then, right, is going to go to the brain. It's going to stimulate more oxytocin to be made. The increase of oxytocin will cause an increase in contractions, pushing against the cervix more, and so on and so forth. So what does this feel like? Does this feel like negative feedback or positive feedback? This is positive feedback. So we're having this pressure on the cervix, and it's going to increase, right, in that same direction. So we're pushing for oxytocin in this case to have greater and greater levels of oxytocin, because oxytocin is going to have the uterus contract more and more and more until what, right? What is going to be the external factor that stops this loop, this positive feedback loop? And that is childbirth, right? The child or the baby will exit from the mother, and there's no more pressure on the cervix. So that is our stop to our positive feedback loop. Let's look at another loop. Here we have body temperature. So our body temperature is at 37, but we're exceeding it. We're getting hot. Sensors like nerve cells and nerve endings in the skin and the brain are sensing this change. They are getting an integration in the brain. So there's temperature regulatory sent to the brain, and that's going to send an effect out, the signal out to our effectors. And our effectors are going to be our sweat glands to start to secrete sweat, right? And then we sweat, and then that temperature is going to feed back, right? So we're trying to drop the temperature here, right? Because sweating is going to cool the body. So does this look like a positive or negative feedback? And this is a negative feedback loop because we're trying to cool the body. We're trying to reach that set point again. All right, so this is a quick clinical connection that your textbook has. So this is heat exhaustion and heat stroke. Living in Southern California, it actually is quite good to know the difference between the two, because heat exhaustion is bad, but heat stroke is deadly. So you want to be able to recognize the signs of heat stroke. So with heat exhaustion, you have massive sweating, right? And this is all looking at negative feedback. So we know that when you're hot, you want to feed back. You want to get your body temperature back to 37 degrees Celsius. So you're going to do a lot of sweating, right? You're going to have reduced blood volume because you're sweating so much. So the sweat is water. And when you're losing water to sweat, we all know that we can get dehydrated if you're not refilling, right, drinking water to put water back in your body because you're sweating out, lots of water. And if you're sweating out lots of water, your blood volume decreases. So the amount of fluid in your blood goes down. You have more blood flow to the skin, right, because you're going to try and radiate the heat away from the core of your body. So the blood vessels in your skin will vasodilate, bringing the blood up to the surface. This is negative feedback. This is normal. You still want to feed back to your normal 37 degrees Celsius. But because of this really extreme heat that your body is getting taxed on, you can have reduced blood pressure, and that blood pressure is due to that blood volume. When you lose blood volume, the pressure is going to drop. You might feel dizzy and faint because of this low blood pressure. There's not going to be enough blood flowing to the brain, and that can cause dizziness and fainting. You feel very flushed, again, because blood flow to the skin is going to make you look red. And then you're going to be wet because you're sweating a lot, okay? Heat stroke, however, there's a problem in the effector. There's a problem in the integration system. Your brain is quote unquote broken, right? So you've been so hot for so long that there's a disruption in the integration system. So your brain is not working right. And it stopped giving your body the signal to sweat. So there's no nervous system response. You're not sweating anymore. This is dangerous, right? Because if you're not sweating, then your body's not cooling down anymore. You'd still have reduced blood volume because you are sweating a lot before the stroke happens. So you've been hot for a very, very long time. Heat stroke is sort of the ultimate end of having had heat exhaustion for a long time. And you still do have the blood flow to the skin. So because we're no longer have the cooling mechanisms in place, we don't have the negative feedback mechanism in place, what we see is we get hotter and hotter and hotter. So we have a positive feedback going on now where your temperature keeps going up. And symptoms of this is, again, reduced blood pressure. And now you're confused and you're very flushed, but you have dry skin. So one of the big clues about whether a person is having heat stroke is that they have dry skin, and you can recognize that. And then having some kind of confusion. All right. So some questions to wrap up. What is the definition of homeostasis? Take a look. All right, so it's going to be letter A, maintenance of relatively constant conditions in the internal environment. Let's try to answer this one. If a regulated variable increases, the homeostatic control system responds by making it decrease. If it decreases, the homeostatic mechanism increases. What is this an example of? And your answer should be negative feedback, letter D. All right, starting with a change in the environment, what is the order for the parts of the homeostatic regulatory mechanism? So if you go through your textbook does go through input and output, but it's letter A. So you have sensors. The sensors will put in a signal to the integrating center. The integrating center will send a signal out to the effectors. Which of the following is true for a person suffering heat stroke? All right, so it should be letter B. Okay, high body temperature causes her to lose the ability to sweat so that all body temperature rises even higher. And that's very dangerous. You can die from heat stroke. And ending on a cartoon. So this is the Awkward Yeti. And I sort of really love the Awkward Yeti. I use it in anatomy a lot. It's just a cartoon using parts of the organs of the body. So this is the pituitary gland. You yield great power, pituitary. Use it wisely. Go now, release the hormone armies and bring balance back to the realm. So the pituitary gland releases a lot of regulatory hormones that we'll look at in the endocrine system. And then just the pituitary gland is very cute. All right. And then for those of you who are looking at this is really cool because the pituitary gland has 3 parts to it. Okay, anterior, posterior, and that intermediate region, which is drawn into this cute little pituitary. All right, and that's the end of chapter 1.